In the last section, we considered arguments for and against God's existence and possible logical problems with the concept of God itself. Can God be both all-powerful and all-good? Can God be unable to do wrong and yet still be able to do everything? Do the laws that govern the universe give us reason to think that God created it for us? And does the fact that these laws make natural disasters inevitable give us reason to think that God did not create it at all? But the question I want to consider this lecture, are freedom and foreknowledge compatible, doesn't fall neatly into a single category. In one way, it raises questions about the concept of God. In another, it causes us to wonder whether the facts of our world are consistent with God's existence. What's more, it's relevant to other philosophical questions regarding the nature of truth, time, and the possibility of free will. So this lecture will serve as a nice transition between the questions we've already considered and another big question of philosophy, the one that is the big question of this new section: do humans have free will? You've probably heard this question before, or even asked it yourself. Do we really have a choice in what we will do if God knows what we're going to do before we do it? It's a question about the compatibility of God's foreknowledge, God's knowledge of the future, and human free will, our ability to freely choose what we will do. Now, to be clear, when I ask whether humans have free will, I'm not asking about their political freedom, that is, how much freedom of action we have under the laws of our government. Nor am I asking how much political freedom a person should have, that is, what kinds of actions should the government lock you up for and what kind of actions should be allowed. We'll consider those questions later. The questions we're considering now regards human free will, or metaphysical freedom. Even if some action is illegal, you can choose to do that action if you have free will in the metaphysical sense. If you do, then how you act is, in every sense of the word, up to you. And if how you act is up to you, then it must be possible for you to act in more than one way. If you're deciding whether to take the bus or the train, each must be a real possibility. Of course, you can't take both at the same time, but to freely choose between them, each must be a genuine option. If the trains are not running that day, well, then you have no choice. This aligns with a classic philosophical intuition, what we might call the libertarian intuition, that free will requires alternate possibilities. In order to freely choose to do some action X, it must be possible to not do action X. If there is only one thing you can do, then you cannot do that action freely. You would have no choice. In fact, that there are alternate possibilities is the assumption you make when you're making a decision. If you thought there was only one possibility, what point would there be in deliberating about what to do? As we've seen, free will is very important to many religious believers. For some, the preservation of free will is the reason God allows moral evil to occur. If the problem of moral evil can be answered, free will plays a major role. Moreover, free will seems to be required for moral responsibility. I can hardly be thought to be morally responsible for doing some action if I was not able to freely decide to do that action. Why? Because I can't be morally responsible for doing an action if not doing that action was impossible. Harry Frankfurt captured this latter intuition in his now famous Principle of Alternate Possibilities, or PAP for short. A person is morally responsible for what he has done only if he could have done otherwise. But the reason it seems that alternate possibilities are necessary for moral responsibility is because free choice is necessary for moral responsibility, and free choice requires alternate possibilities. But if free will is necessary for moral responsibility, then it's even more important to the theist who believes that God holds us morally responsible for our actions. It would make little sense for God to punish someone for sinning if not doing that sin wasn't possible. And what moral credit could one receive for doing something noble if it literally wasn't possible for her to do anything else? Nevertheless, many argue that the existence of God is logically incompatible with the idea that we have free will. It's not logically possible for free will and God to coexist. Why? Well, some people believe that God has predetermined everything that ever has or will happen. God decided beforehand what the entire history of the universe would be and makes sure things will turn out just as he wants by controlling it all directly. Clearly, if this is the case, there is no human free will. But this shows a logical incompatibility between predestination and free will, not foreknowledge and free will, which is our concern. Having foreknowledge that I will do something is not the same as making me do it. So, why might foreknowledge and free will be incompatible? Well, suppose you're deciding whether to give $100 to a friend in need or spend that money on an expensive meal. Suppose God already knew yesterday what you were going to decide to do. Of course, we don't know what belief God held yesterday, thus we don't know the content of his knowledge, but whatever you will do, God already knew that you would do it. Is it possible for you to do other than what God already believed you would do? Seems not. Why? Well, if God believed yesterday that you would give away the money, then you cannot spend it. Spending it would entail either that God had a false belief, that he was wrong about what you were going to do, or that he had a different belief than he actually had. Now, clearly God can't have a false belief, he's omniscient, but he also can't have a different belief than he already had. The past is now fixed, it cannot be changed. So if God believed yesterday that you would give away the money, then spending the money isn't possible. And if he had believed that you would spend it, you could do nothing but spend the money. It may seem like both are possible since we don't know what God believes. But if God exists, God has already formed a belief about what you will do. So we know this is an illusion. Only one option is possible, the one that God already believed that you would take. Simply put, to have the power to act contrary to how God already believed you would behave, to have that power, you would either have to have the power to make God's belief false or to change the past, to make God believe something other than what he already believed. But you don't have the power to do either of those things. God can't have false beliefs, and once the past has occurred, there is no changing it. God's already having an infallible belief about what you will do entails that you can do nothing else. And if you can do nothing else, then you cannot act freely, since freedom requires alternate possibilities. This is the freedom foreknowledge problem, a problem that has existed for centuries, but was made popular again by Nelson Pike in a 1965 paper entitled Divine Omniscience and Voluntary Action. Freedom and foreknowledge appear to be incompatible. If God exists and is omniscient, it seems that we can't be free. And if we are not free, then we cannot be held morally responsible for what we do. This is problematic for theistic belief for many reasons, not the least of which it makes the preservation of free will an inadequate response to the problem of moral evil. Now, there are a number of common solutions to the freedom foreknowledge problem, but most of them fall short. A misunderstanding of the problem is often at the root of their failure. For example, some suggest that freedom and foreknowledge are compatible because God's foreknowledge does not cause you to act as you do. By having foreknowledge, God is not using his power to actively force you to make a certain decision. But the freedom foreknowledge problem does not suggest that you are not free because God has made you do anything. If you look at the argument, you will see that no such language is used. In fact, I was careful to distinguish that problem from the problem of predestination, which does suggest that God makes you act as you do. The freedom foreknowledge problem is not a problem of action, but of logical consequence. The suggestion that God has foreknowledge logically entails that you do not have alternate possibilities. That if you don't have alternate possibilities, you aren't free. We might say, if we are to freely choose how to act, then how we will act must still be up in the air before we make the decision. Even though God's foreknowledge does not make us behave as we will, God's foreknowledge entails that how we will act is not still up in the air. God can't know something unless it's factual. So God's knowledge of how we will act entails that there is already a fact of the matter about how we will choose to act. So it's not up in the air. The choice is not free. Others suggest middle knowledge as a solution to the freedom foreknowledge problem. This is the suggestion that God knows how every person would freely choose to behave in every possible circumstance, and that God can know what actions you will take in the future by simply knowing which person you are. He knows what situation you will be put in and how you will choose to behave in that situation. Although middle knowledge is regularly touted as a solution to the freedom foreknowledge problem, it's nothing of the kind. It doesn't even address the problem, actually. The doctrine itself that God can know how every possible person will freely choose to behave in every circumstance just assumes that freedom and foreknowledge are compatible. It assumes that foreknowledge of a free choice is possible, not only for you, but also for every person that could ever exist. Yet it does not explain how this is possible, nor does it suggest a reason to doubt the premises or structure of the freedom foreknowledge argument. In fact, Luis de Molina, the 16th century Jesuit theologian responsible for the doctrine of middle knowledge, admitted as much and instead suggested an alternative solution to the freedom foreknowledge problem. This solution, which is also defended by the 20th century philosopher J.T. Saunders and Alvin Plantinga, is called the backtracking counterfactual objection. Now, that sounds complicated, but the suggestion is pretty simple. The suggestion is that even if God does have foreknowledge, it's still within your power to act otherwise, because if you were to act otherwise, then God would have just had a different belief than he did. Of course, you won't act otherwise, but you could, because if you did, then God's past belief would have been different. Unfortunately, this solution misunderstands the problem. Of course, the backtracking counterfactual is true. If you were to act differently, God would have had a different belief than he had. The problem is the latter is no longer possible. God can't have believed differently than he did. The fact that God believed as he did is already a fact, written in the past, which cannot be undone. It's true that if you were to act otherwise, God would have believed differently than he did, but God's believing differently than he did is no longer possible. So your acting otherwise is no longer possible. Proponents of the backtracking counterfactual objection admit that you won't act otherwise, but fail to realize that this is true because you can't act otherwise. This failed solution, however, does help us get at the heart of the problem. Although the backtracking counterexamples do not help solve the problem, such counterfactuals are still true. If you were to behave differently, God would have believed differently. This is because it is our future action that determines the content of God's past knowledge. I don't do what I do because God foreknew I would do it. Again, the freedom foreknowledge problem does not suggest that God's foreknowledge causes your action. Instead, God knows what I will do because he can see my future actions before I do them. Now, we probably don't want to say that my future actions cause God to believe what he did. Causation is supposed to run forward from the past to the future, not from the future to the past. But we could say that God's past belief is non-causally dictated by my future action. For example, I'm in Virginia because I'm standing here recording a lecture for the Great Courses. But that's not what caused me to be in Virginia. My drive here caused that. In the same way, God's past belief is what it is because of my future action. Again, this does not solve the problem, but it does help us better understand it. If the content of God's past belief is determined by my future action, then that future action must already be a reality. My future action can't dictate the content of God's past belief unless it exists. Simply put, if God knows what you're going to do tomorrow, then he's already seen you doing it. But if he's already seen you doing it, then your future action must already exist in some way even before it occurs. God couldn't look into the future yesterday unless the future already existed yesterday. But if the future already exists, well, then it's not open. There is not more than one possible future. And if there's only one possible future, then there are no alternate possibilities, and thus there cannot be free will. It's kind of like you're in a movie theater watching a movie, wondering how it will end. You can imagine many alternate possible endings, but there's really only one way the movie can end. As you're watching it, every frame of the movie is already wound into the reel in a certain sequence. Even though you only see one frame at a time, the end of the movie already exists before you've even seen it. The doctrine of divine foreknowledge suggests that our timeline is like that movie reel. God can know what the future holds only if it already exists. Sure, each moment is being shown to us in a certain order, but they all already exist. Consequently, no other future is possible, just like no other ending of the movie is possible, and thus free will is impossible. Philosophically speaking, God's foreknowledge is incompatible with free will because it entails a temporal ontology, a view of time called omnitemporalism that is incompatible with free will. If free will requires alternate possibilities, one cannot be free if the future already exists. Yet God having foreknowledge entails omnitemporalism, that the future must already exist. Although God's foreknowledge does not make you do what you do, it does entail that your future actions are already written on the timeline. The failure of another solution to this problem may make the problem even clearer. Some suggest that God is atemporal, that God is outside the timeline and thus doesn't believe anything at a particular past moment. Instead, God sits above the timeline, knowing it as a whole, kind of looking down on it as a whole. Some think this can somehow solve the freedom foreknowledge problem. But instead, it actually makes it worse. We cannot be free without alternate possibilities. And there are no alternate possibilities if the future already exists. But if God sits outside the entire timeline, then the entire timeline, past, present, and future, well, then the future exists. So this solution actually reinforces the problem by reinforcing a temporal ontology that is incompatible with free will, omnitemporalism. But the failure of this solution also reveals that God's existence and foreknowledge is somewhat irrelevant to the problem. Suppose the future already exists, but God doesn't have foreknowledge of it. Or even that God doesn't exist at all. Does that solve the problem? Are there now alternate possibilities? No. As long as omnitemporalism is true, there is only one possible future, and thus no human free will. It's omnitemporalism that's the problem. God's foreknowledge entails that omnitemporalism is true, but if there are other reasons to think that omnitemporalism is true, you could be an atheist, but you'd still be stuck with the problem. And indeed, there are other reasons to think that omnitemporalism is true. As we discussed in earlier lectures, one of the basic axioms of logic is that every proposition is either true or false. This, of course, includes propositions about the future. Imagine any of your future actions that you like, and it's either true or it's false that you will perform that action. Recall, however, that it's also the case that propositions have the truth values they have for a reason. If a proposition is true, that's because it corresponds to the way the world is. I am in Virginia is true in virtue of the fact that it corresponds to a state of the world, me being in Virginia. The correspondence theory of truth entails that propositions have truth makers. But consider a true proposition that expressed the fact about one of your future decisions. What is that proposition's truth maker? Well, what could it be besides the future state of affairs, the future decision of yours to which that proposition refers? But a future decision can make a proposition true right now only if that future decision exists right now. Yes, it's not occurring presently, but we have to include it in our temporal ontology if we are to have a truth maker for that future tense proposition about your future decision. Again, we can turn to the movie reel example. If we already know there is a fact of the matter about how the movie will end, then we know the ending is already there at the end of the reel of the film. Likewise, if there is a fact of the matter about how we will choose to behave at a certain moment, then we know that the future moment in which we will behave that way already exists. And since the laws of logic tell us that all propositions must have a truth value, either true or false, we know there is already a fact of the matter about all our future behaviors. Nobody even needs to know what the facts of the matter are about our future behavior for this to be a problem. God's foreknowledge ultimately has nothing to do with it. I may not know which propositions about my future actions are true or false, but the basic axioms of logic tell me that they are either true or false. And either way, there must be a state of affairs that determines their truth value. Consider Richard Taylor's story of Osmo. A man named Osmo stumbles upon a book called The Life of Osmo, which seems to tell his entire life story. Picks up the book, he reads the book from his birth to the present day, and it gets everything right, all the way up to the sentence about him finding the book and reading it. He realizes that the book has been on the shelf for a long while, and in fact was published before his birth. So he skips to the end to read about the flight he will take and how he perishes when the aircraft crashes on the runway at Fort Wayne. So he decides that he can prevent his own death by never getting on a plane to Fort Wayne. But 3 years later, he takes a flight to St. Paul, and then that flight is diverted to Fort Wayne. Osmo hijacks the plane in hopes of landing it at another airfield and ends up causing the crash himself. It seems quite clear that Osmo cannot act other than the book says he will. But notice that the existence of the book is irrelevant because its existence is not what makes him unfree. The book does not control his action, but the existence of the book does make us realize that Osmo's life was already written before it occurred. The book is merely a collection of all the true propositions about Osmo's life. But all those propositions were true regardless of whether they were collected into a book or not. Osmo's life was pre-written even if the book never existed. But that's true for all of us. There is a set of true propositions that describes your life. Theoretically, they could be collected in a book. Give enough monkeys typewriters for enough time and one of them would produce that book. But it doesn't even need to be written for us to realize that the propositions that describe our life must all have truth makers and that those truth makers would be all the events of our life. Since those propositions would be true before our life occurs, all the events of our lives must exist before they occur. Ultimately, the basic axioms of logic and the correspondence theory of truth entail a temporal ontology, omnitemporalism, that is incompatible with free will. This problem, known as logical fatalism, is as old as Aristotle. He raised it in his famous sea battle argument, where he argued that if it was true yesterday that a sea battle will occur, then the occurrence of the sea battle tomorrow must be fated. And in my estimation, most philosophers do not take this problem seriously enough. But others take it so seriously that they're willing to reject that basic axiom of logic and suggest that not all propositions have a truth value. For example, perhaps propositions about our future actions are neither true nor false until we make or fail to make the choice in question. If so, then we don't need future events as truth makers, just present and past ones. This suggestion allows us to reject omnitemporalism and embrace a temporal ontology called the growing block. According to it, all that exists is the present and the past just continually grows as the occurrence of the present adds moments to it. But suggesting that propositions about the future are neither true nor false would require us to develop a new system of logic. So maybe propositions could have three truth values, something like true, false, or indeterminate, as philosopher Craig Bourne has suggested. Or maybe the truth value of propositions falls along a continuum, with 0 being false and 1 being true, and all the decimal numbers in between representing degrees of truth. This is akin to the suggestion of Czech philosopher Willem Novak. These are intriguing suggestions, but it is extremely difficult to get so-called multi-valued or fuzzy logic systems to cohere with all of our logical intuitions. For example, it appears obvious that for any given future action you might take, the following proposition is true. Either you will do that action or you will not do that action. In fact, the statement is not only true, the statement's a tautology. It must be true for any given proposition, either P or not P. But as a disjunctive statement, it is only true if one of its disjuncts is true. But if there is no fact of the matter about what future action you will take, then it is neither true that you will do the action, nor true that you won't do the action. A is neither true nor false. But if it's neither true nor false, then either A or not A, well, that's not true. Yet it must be, since it's a tautology. That's not to say that multi-valued logic can't be made to work, but this is part of my dissertation. And in my opinion, there hasn't been a resolution to such problems that has acceptable consequences. Another temporal ontology that might present a solution is called presentism, which was endorsed by Arthur Pryor in the mid-20th century. Like its name suggests, presentism rejects the existence of the past and future and suggests that all that exists only exists in the present. Unfortunately, embracing presentism will not allow us to resolve the logical threat to free will unless we also reject traditional bivalent logic. Presentists still acknowledge the correspondence theory of truth, and thus that all propositions, including those about the future, need truth makers. To serve this function, current-day presentists introduce presently existing abstract objects, something very much like Plato's forms. Presentist William Lane Craig calls them tensed worlds. But regardless of what they're called, my acting otherwise will still be contrary to something that exists. Instead of a future existing event, it will be an existing abstract object. So it seems that even on presentism, I am still not free. Okay. Let's close by considering one last objection that may have been going through your head this entire time. Even if the future exists, can't I just change the future? Can't that be how I'm free? This reply is quite common, but quite problematic. Suppose the future contains the event of you choosing to eat pizza at noon tomorrow. So the future now today contains that event. But you think you have the power to change this fact tomorrow by eating a turkey sandwich instead. So suppose that you eat a turkey sandwich tomorrow at lunch. Well, then was it the case the previous day that the future contained the event of you eating pizza? Clearly not. since you ate a turkey sandwich. By eating the turkey sandwich, you made it the case that the future had always contained the event of you eating the turkey sandwich. It was never true that you were going to eat pizza. A moment in time can't go from holding one event to later holding another. It can't have been true that you were going to eat pizza if, when the time comes, you eat a sandwich instead. The notion of changing the future is logically incoherent. Unfortunately, metaphysical free will forces still more threats. Even if we can avoid being committed to omnitemporalism philosophically, we're still committed to it scientifically. Einstein's theory of relativity, one of the most well-confirmed theories in all of science, also entails omnitemporalism as well. Because it suggests simultaneity is relative and yet demands that no reference frame is privileged, it suggests that the universe exists as one giant space-time block in which space-time events share temporal relations, but there is no absolute past, present, or future. If you'd like to know more, I talk about this in detail in my Exploring Metaphysics course. That brings us to our next lecture, because, as we shall see, omnitemporalism is not the only thing that raises serious questions about free will. Many other arguments, both philosophic and scientific, suggest that human free will may indeed be an illusion. The answer to the big question of this section, do humans have free will, may simply be no.